Canada is an officially bilingual country. It says so right in the Official Languages Act, passed more than 50 years ago. Why then do new census data paint a picture of a very multilingual country that seems to be speaking less French every year? With us to explore that, we welcome in Montreal, Quebec, Conrad Yakabuski, columnist at the Globe and Mail, who has been reporting on Quebec for many years. In the nation's capital, Louisa Varonis, Associate Professor in Social Geography and Research Chair in Francophone Immigration at the University of Ottawa. And here in our studio, Normand Labrie, Professor and Interim Dean at the U of T's OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and J.J. McCullough, columnist at the Washington Post and a Canadian YouTuber, and we are delighted to have all four of you on our program tonight. And let's start, without further ado, with some numbers from Statistics Canada, which will be very concerning for some of you and some of our viewers. Outside of the province of Quebec, only 9.5% of Canadians can speak both French and English. 1 in 10 Canadians outside the province of Quebec. Almost 60% of bilingual Canadians live in Quebec. About a quarter live in Ontario. And as you go further out west, the numbers really drop. 5% in BC, 4% in New Brunswick. That's out east, obviously. 3.9% in Alberta, 4.8% in other provinces and territories. Now, how is French faring across the country? Let's look at that. From the years 2016 to 2021, the proportion of Canadians speaking French at home dropped in every part of Canada except Yukon. It's now south of 20%. The number of Canadians living outside Quebec whose first official language is French declined to 3.3%. A quarter of Canadians now speak a mother tongue other than English or French, and the most widely spoken were Mandarin and Punjabi. Languages such as Italian, Polish, and Greek, they are all on the decline. Okay, let's get into this. Louisa, I'm going to come to you first. Former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's dad, once said, all Canadians should capitalize on the advantages of living in a country which has learned to speak in two great world languages, making full use of the skills and energy of all its citizens. So tell us, why is striving for a bilingual country, in your judgment, essential for Canada?
For many reasons, obviously, but to start, it's part of the foundation of what Canada is today, and it has shaped a unique identity and culture. And many Canadians in other polls have shown that being bilingual, speaking French and English, is fundamental. But above all, I would really encourage people to consider becoming bilingual in French and English, primarily because of our context, because it opens a worldview that is different. Learning a language is more than just being able to speak in a foreign language. It's accessing a culture, a different point of view, a different understanding of the world. And by having this knowledge, it opens up opportunities, better understanding, respect, and tolerance. And Canadians are known for these things specifically. And so we're richer as individuals for learning and speaking more than one language.
All right, let me follow up with Conrad on that. I think it's fair to say the current Prime Minister's father did have a dream once upon a time of a country where millions of people could speak both official languages and communicate basically in both official languages. Not perfectly, but basically. Is that dream, in your judgment, essentially dead?
Well, for someone of my generation, obviously, I'm the first generation to have grown up under official bilingualism. So for someone of my generation, when Quebec politics, for instance, was at the core of a lot of what happened in this country, the dream is dead. I mean, I write a column for the Globe and Mail, and because I'm based in Quebec, I write a lot on Quebec politics, and I just notice over the years how there's so much less interest in the rest of the country for Quebec politics, and there's so much less investment on the part of Canadians outside Quebec in trying to bridge the cultural divides in the country. And that's largely a function of how much Canada has evolved since the Official Language Act was passed. There are more people who speak Mandarin and Punjabi outside Quebec in large parts, or certainly in most parts of the country, than speak French. And so that And partly it's a function of the fact that there's just not enough qualified teachers outside of Quebec to actually teach Quebec French to English Canadians. So it's a complicated story, but yeah, I do think the dream is dead.
Was the dream, JJ, in your opinion, a fool's errand to begin with?
I think it was. I think it was always based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what this country was. You know, I think when you had leaders like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, these were people that were very much products of Quebec political culture that very much sort of conceptualized the existence of Canada as like a marriage between Quebec and Ontario. And that was like the fundamental reality of this country. And thus a policy like bilingualism made a kind of sense if you conceptualize the country that way, as kind of a marriage, you know, the two founding nations, a very Eastern Canadian sort of centric conception of what this country is. You know, I'm from Western Canada, I'm from Vancouver. So we have a very different understanding of the history of this country, which is that, yeah, perhaps that's how the country started, Ontario and Quebec, and then, you know, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But then, you know, the entire western half of this continent was, you know, annexed and colonized and was settled by waves of people from Eastern Europe, from other parts of Europe, speaking all sorts of different languages, and then, you know, people coming from Asia and from Africa and elsewhere, and creating, you know, what I think even by the late 1960s, early 1970s, was already a very diverse multicultural country in which the idea that this was fundamentally a bilingual, bicultural country was just a dated and incorrect assumption. And I think what we've seen over the last 50 years is a failed social experiment based on false assumptions, trying to turn this country into something that it wasn't even at the time that the Official Languages Act was introduced.
A failed social experiment.
Well, let's come back to that legislation, which was the Official Languages Act. We think about it in terms of bilingualism, but if you read the legislation, it allows for Canadians to remain monolingual. It's the public service from the federal government that will be offered in the language of the citizen that requests the services. So it's not a legislation to make every Canadian bilingual. The dream is at another level, I would say. It has been a vision that of the politicians of that time.
But do you still ascribe to that dream? Do you still aspire to that dream?
Well, it is partly achieved and mostly where the highest concentrations of bilinguals are in Quebec, in particularly Montreal, among all the francophone minorities outside of Quebec. That's where the level of bilingualism is the strongest. Then you see, if you look at immersion, which is very popular across the country, the objective, I think, for students to go through immersion is not necessarily to become like fully fluent in the language, but they have a dream. They want to better understand the country. They want to be able to interact, to communicate, and they may want to play a role at the national level later on in their life. I think they're pursuing a dream, and we have evidence to immersion of it's so popular that many Canadians, millions of Canadians have been pursuing that.
Are buying into it.
Louisa, the statistics, then we have to look at those, like the number of people who speak French at home increases. It's the proportion that decreases because there is population growth through immigration.
Yes,
so,
among other groups.
Yeah.
Louisa, to what extent do you think Francophones who live outside of the province of Quebec, to what extent do you think they currently feel under threat?
Some of them, I think, with the recent census data, feel definitely under threat. And I really want to underline what my colleague, Monsieur Labrie, just said about the actual numbers have been growing, even though the statistics, the percentages go a different trend. And depending on the regions and the locations, so geography does play a role, both in the degree of bilingualism, the possibility to live in one or both languages, and the feeling of threat. So currently, with the numbers and some of the recent policies, Francophone minorities feel under threat. Even within Quebec, being in Quebec City, in Montreal, or in Gatineau is very different. In Gatineau, there is definitely more of a feeling of a threat because of the presence at the interprovincial border with Ontario of English being there and potentially invading, and the tensions, the cultural politics that were mentioned. Then minorities farther away outside of Quebec, the level of minoritization, like the degree of minority, increases. And there's no other way but to be bilingual. So we can also look at asymmetrical bilingualism. Francophones, especially outside of Quebec, are bilingual. There's no way, you can't get by. It's Anglophones maybe not aware of the need of being bilingual or French. So the degrees of bilingualism and the data do show that, but also the feeling of minoritization. So the current numbers have really, rung an alarm for Francophones and the level of threat. And therefore, Canada has developed a Francophone immigration policy to attract Francophone immigrants from different parts of the world, and they can be Francophiles, to come and help and support and create that critical mass in order to have institutions. But as Monsieur Labrie explained, French immersion has huge success. So even though the dream in reality the numbers may not show, but the dream is there, and Canadians and immigrants in particular are embracing it. A lot of newcomers put the kids in French immersion, and Francophone immigrants in a minority context come with the reality that, in fact, French is not spoken everywhere as they thought, but rather that they have to learn English. So this asymmetrical bilingualism, if you're Francophone, you have to be bilingual. There is no choice there. And this is another important incentive in recognizing the importance of bilingualism, to have opportunities at least to communicate even in basic terms.
Let me get JJ to follow up on that if I can. And that is, I take your point that if you're from Western Canada, your vision or understanding of the uses of French and English might be different than if you grow up, very close to the Quebec-Ontario border. But do you feel some sympathy for Francophones living outside Quebec who are feeling under threat right now in the way that Louisa just explained?
The implication is that there is some sort of hierarchies of people in Canada, and that the French Canadians are somehow the first within the multicultural fabric of the country. And I just think that that is an argument that is not persuasive to a lot of people in Western Canada. And frankly, I even think a lot of people here, in Ontario, say, a very multicultural, diverse place. If you're speaking Chinese, you have to struggle. If you're speaking Punjab, you have to struggle. You have to sort of assimilate. You have to learn to speak English to communicate. But it's not a matter of sort of like the English being a kind of like elite class that is imposing a sort of like ethnic hegemony on you. You speak the English language because it is the most useful language of communication. And everywhere else, all other immigrants, all other linguistic minorities kind of have to make peace with that reality in order to function in modern Canada.
Well, accept that. Yes, they're a linguistic minority, but they're also one of the founding peoples of the country.
But what does that mean? What does that, they're not the founding people of British Columbia, right? They're not the founding people of Ontario. This is a very dated, very Eastern Canadian conception of what Canada is. There's no mention of two founding people in the Constitution of Canada, right? There's linguistic rights that are granted, in my view, somewhat arbitrarily because, Pierre Elliott Trudeau sort of enshrined his idea of what this country is in defiance of a growing part of the country that, frankly, I think he didn't understand, didn't care much about. And when I hear some of these conversations, when we hear the reinforcing of this hierarchy that the French are the first among equals in the diverse multicultural nature of Canada, I just think that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Why French? Why not Chinese? Why not Italian? Why not German?
Conrad, you want to come in on that?
Well, I have to speak to what you mentioned. It is part of our history. Canada as an independent country would not exist had it not been for a pact, whether you call it two founding people. Maybe that term is outdated, but it did require an agreement by
who?
A French Canadian elite in Quebec at the time to agree to this sort of experiment called Canada. And of course the country has evolved then, but do you throw the baby out with the bathwater? As Louisa mentioned, bilingualism is about more than just speaking another language. It's about broadening your view. And if part of our history has been an ability to, not perfectly, but perhaps better than most countries, bridge our differences, the fact that we have two founding cultures is a big part of that. And the conversation has widened in recent decades, obviously, as we become more aware of the need for reconciliation and to broaden the definition of Canada. But Canada is not Canada, really, without our link to our history. And that history is one of two peoples who emerged from, Great Britain and France.
JJ, you want to come back on that?
I think that, for a kind of modern progressive person, those kind of arguments must be a little bit uncomfortable to say, because they do seem to be enforcing that there is a rigid hierarchy of peoples in this country, and that sort of like the French have special rights that are just granted to them by some sort of historic birthright that is sort of an immigrant who comes from China, tomorrow doesn't have.
Well, I could just add that, the English in Quebec have historical rights.
Yeah, and that's problematic too.
Outside Quebec have historical rights.
I know, but this is all problematic. It's a hierarchy. It's creating a hierarchy of peoples in this country that I just feel is at odds with the kind of democratic, liberal, egalitarian society that modern day Canada is supposed to be. We've come a long way from the 19th century, and I think it strikes a lot of sort of younger people, a lot of new Canadians, as just odd that we devote so much time and energy to continuing to try to enforce a vision of Canada that is so dated in its conception and so anti-democratic in its conception. The idea of creating a hierarchy of people, and as you yourself have conceded, right, now we're sort of talking about the Indigenous people more, and we're trying to like sort of awkwardly slot them into like, where do they fit into this official hierarchy? Do they outrank the French, or are they below the French? And you know very well that these sorts of things become huge political contentious issues in modern day Quebec politics, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Okay, let me get Norman in here, because I mean, this is a view that has been around for a very long time. Pierre Trudeau used to have to deal with this view of the country as well. Do you take offense at it?
No, I don't take offense. I would just say that language policies are compromises when tensions arise among peoples. Often languages don't play a role at all, but at some times of history, languages become contentious and become a political object. And I think the language policies that emerged in the 60s, 70s in Quebec, Canada, have been compromises to keep the nation together. And without those, it's not so much, I would say, to establish hierarchies, but in order to bring people together to accept to live together and build a common country.
Do you understand, though, why somebody from British Columbia would have very little interest in this particular conversation?
I guess that would be another conversation, more at more like a political level of does British Columbia want to be Canadian or not?
So you're saying like we're less Canadian if we don't embrace French to the same extent?
Well, if you accept that those compromises were not necessary or superfluous today, I think that challenges the notion itself of Canada and the nation.
Let's understand this. Do you think all federal public servants ought to be fluently bilingual?
All the services have to be delivered in either French or English, depending on what the citizens require. So they don't all have to do that, but the services have to be delivered.
So if you are a Francophone in northern British Columbia and you want to have services with your federal government, there should be somebody in northern British Columbia who can bring you those services in French.
Maybe it's not like before the pandemic, I would have said partly yes, like because you would have walked to the office and you would have wanted to meet with somebody. I think now with the new technologies, the way automatic translation functions, we get automatic translation on Google or any other system. I think it's much more easier. So I think services have to be delivered in French or English if you request the services in English. But I think it's less, maybe less important to be in northern British Columbia and have access to a certain service.
Well, let me ask the British Columbian. Do you think federal public servants ought to be able to provide services to both French and English people in the language of their choosing, regardless of where they live in the country?
No, I don't think that's a practical goal at all. Because, and again, this is reinforcing the idea that there's a hierarchy of people, right? Like a Chinese guy can't walk into northern British Columbia and expect, if he's speaking Mandarin, to have service.
Chinese are not one of the founding peoples back involved in the original compromise of 1867, et cetera, et cetera.
But this isn't even I don't even think that's even accurate understanding of what 1867 was about. Like if you look at what, John A. Macdonald and the Fathers of Confederation were, hammering out in Charlottetown, they weren't spending a lot of time talking about language policy in northern British Columbia, right? This is sort of like a retcon that we've sort of retroactively decided the founding of Canada was about language policy. It was not. It was, they viewed it in very ethnic and racialized kind of terms. It's like the two people have to have an equal say in the governance of the country in ways that are dated and even slightly offensive. But again, I'm saying that the way that the way that language has evolved is that English is now recognized as kind of like the broad language of global communication. It is the most practical language for people of diverse backgrounds to speak to each other for maximum communication. And I think, most immigrants who come to this country understand that. Again, like they don't feel that like by learning English, they're opting into like some sort of English Anglo hegemony, right? They're understanding that this is just practical. If I want to speak in a country where there's Punjabi speakers and Chinese speakers and Italian speakers and German speakers, we need some sort of common language to communicate, and English seems like the most practical one. Having French sort of in this equation, in that context, it's completely defies sort of utilitarian logic. It is only justifiable in this kind of sentimental, historical, backwards-looking conception of what Canada is supposed to be.
That got a laugh from Yakubuski out of town. I heard that. Okay. Let's put some stats on the record here, if we can. Sheldon, we are on page 4 in the middle, please. Bilingualism inside Quebec. These numbers from 2016 to 2021. Bilingualism in Quebec increased 2%. 2%. To 46.4%. For the first time in Canadian history, the number of Quebecers whose first official language is English topped 1 million, or 13% of the population. Nearly 3/4 of Quebecers now list French as their mother tongue. That sounds like a lot, but it's a 2.3% decrease. Okay, Conrad, you're there. Quebecers are heading to the polls next month. You're in the middle of a provincial election campaign right now. Are these kinds of numbers influencing the campaign that is unfolding in Quebec these days?
Well, language is top of mind. It's always top of mind in Quebec, and immigration is top of mind in Quebec. I think the numbers that are probably the most determining or the most that move political debate in Quebec is the fact that the symbolic threshold of 80% francophone has been breached. I mean, it was breached a couple of censuses ago, but as it continues to decline, the number of people who speak French, or the proportion of people who speak French, declines below 80%. But the real kicker is the island of Montreal, where it's below 50% now, the number of people who speak primarily French at home. And those are the two numbers that drive political debate the most, and that is what determines. And because the Montreal region is home to 70% of new immigrants to Quebec, it's the ground zero for the debate. And so the numbers from the census just sort of fed into a debate about how to reverse the trend if possible, but at least stabilize it. And that goes to the Francisization of immigrants and the number of immigrants Quebec accepts on an annual basis. And so that's what drives the electoral campaign. And you have two parties, the Coalition Avenir Québec governing party and the Parti québécois, either arguing to stabilize immigration levels at current levels or to, in the PQ's case, reduce them. And you have the more progressive parties arguing that Quebec can accept more immigrants, which it desperately needs because its working age population is shrinking, without sacrificing its French culture and heritage.
Well, let me put this to Louisa, because this is something that the current Premier of Quebec has said, and something that I have heard many Quebec politicians over the years say, and that is, if the trends continue the way they're going and English becomes more predominant and French becomes less predominant, Quebec will become Louisiana. That's what they say. Basically a sort of a quaint place where you can, maybe read a menu in French, but frankly, it's not the language of everyday Quebec anymore. That's the fear. Is that a rational fear in your view?
It could be. Rational in the sense that Quebec and Francophones feel isolated in North America. And in a way, our colleague did mention a hierarchy. The hierarchy I see is really the English at the top and what is known as Anglo-normativity for reasons that seem practical. And I take offense at thinking that, Francophones were colonizers, but Anglophones were not. What we're seeing in North America is really the success of British colonization. This is what we see. And there is the tension with other groups, Spanish speaking, going further south, and French speakers. And I see having French as recognizing the fact that there are other peoples and really Canada, with its policies around bilingualism, in fact, opened up the way to a multicultural society where other languages are also recognized. So yes, especially in Vancouver, and I know because we're doing research on Francophone immigration in Vancouver, Francophones are much smaller than Chinese and Punjabis and some other groups. But this has opened up the opportunity of having more than one person sitting around the table, and I really liked Monsieur Labry's reference to bringing together, accommodating in a way that everybody's recognized equal. So it's funny how we look at the same thing, but I see opportunities for more equality and recognition of different groups, and maybe we shouldn't limit to French, because practically in Vancouver, for example, speaking different Chinese languages or South Asian languages is more useful and important to more people. So we don't want to become the city of Babel either. Nevertheless, these openings. So yes, I do understand the fear in Quebec, and there is perception from some immigrants that the imposition, not being able to choose whether they can send their children to school in French or English, is a difficult decision. But many do embrace it, and in fact, Montreal is becoming a lot more multicultural and multilingual, and we're seeing a world of multilingualism and plurilingualism where a lot of people speak multiple languages. So speaking French and English really is an advantage in a globalized world, because there are many parts of the world where English is actually not spoken. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which is huge and growing, and here at play are the demographic trends. Canada
okay, forgive me for jumping in here, Louisa, but I'm running out of time, and I want to get Normand on that same question. The notion of Quebec turning into Louisiana, do you worry about that?
Personally, I don't worry about that. I think often immigration and language are instrumentalized by political parties, and especially with electoral campaigns. But in fact, if you look at Quebec, like there is a need of a workforce, which is, like Mr. Conrad just mentioned, that they need immigration to be able to fill the vacant jobs. Currently, the proportion of the population of Quebec compared to the rest of Canada, if there is no important immigration, would decrease. So the power of Quebec within the Confederation would also decrease. So there is a very great incentives to maintain a high level of immigration. So it may be a debates during campaigns, but in fact the needs are stronger, I think, than the ideologies that are being discussed during the campaigns.
Conrad, you know, of course, that separatism, we're told, is down at the moment, but some of us have lived long enough to know that it comes back and rears its head from time to time. And I wonder whether you think that a potentially steady drop of French speaking in this country could contribute to a newfound desire among Quebecers to separate.
Well, I think that's always in the back of the heads of everyone in Quebec and every politician in Quebec. Polls continually show that at least a third of Quebecers would still vote yes in a referendum. And that's in a context where, we're still sort of recovering from previous referenda and divisive political debate, where there was this sense that the domination of that one question prevented Quebec from tackling other issues which are important to society as well. And so no one wants to head back into that era, but at the same time, if you like JJ mentioned, if you think that the rest of Canada, if you take away that vision of Canada, that's a very powerful argument for Quebec to begin to start talking about going its own way again. Because, the founding pact, whether you agree that, it's an asymmetry of rights. People have historical rights, and it's very hard to take historical rights away from anyone, no matter what country you're talking about. It's not an unprecedented situation. So it's all about accommodation and compromise. That's the way countries evolve and constitutions evolve. And so that absolutely, there is a sense that we are drifting apart more actually as a country simply because of this disinterest in the rest of Canada you talk about French immersion, but let's face it, I mean, people are not sending their kids to French immersion so that they're steeped in Quebecois culture and French Canadian history. I mean, there have been surveys that show that we have talked about French immersion as a streaming process, but also the fact that kids who go through French immersion don't necessarily retain a lot of the French when they get into adulthood because they don't use it. And I think one of the failures of French immersion in Canada is precisely to address this issue of planting the seeds of some kind of interest and passion in a bicultural, bilingual country. And bilingual and bicultural does not mean you exclude the multicultural nature of Canada. It's another aspect of Canada that speaks to our evolution and history as a country, which is very important to understanding what it is to live in a country called Canada.
Well, I want to better understand JJ's position on this, and with a couple of minutes to go, I wonder whether you'd be happier with a Canada that is sort of officially unilingual, with the one language being English.
Well, I mean, again, English is the most practical language for maximum communication with a diverse populace, right? And this is true all over the world. I saw a clip the other day of Zelensky talking with President Macron, negotiating stuff about weapons and things in the context of the war. They were speaking English to each other. And I don't think either of those men felt in that moment, I am being oppressed by like the evil English, whatever, the system of whatever. They just sort of think like, this is practical. We speak different languages. What can be a bridge language that can help us sort of communicate? And I think when you go all over the world, this attitude is very mainstream. It is really only in Quebec that they have this very rigid sort of zero-sum attitude towards language. And I think this is part of the problem that causes some of this tension that is tearing this country apart or whatever, which is the idea that there has been, despite the existence of people like me, a lot of English Canadians have made good faith attempts to learn French or to get their kids into French immersion schools, and it doesn't stick, it doesn't take. But on the other hand, then you have Quebec, where they keep electing these demagogic premiers in charge who treat any infiltration of the English language at any level as this great existential threat to their integrity as a nation, right? And so there's kind of a sense that this is not a really sort of like equal game, and that the Quebecers have a rather extreme attitude that is like very far removed from like what you see in Germany or Holland or Sweden or other sort of places where they speak a European language, but then also have very high rates of English fluency, because it's just seen as a practical way to get ahead in a modern globalized world. And so I think one of the issues that we have to face is that I don't think Quebec is going to become a Louisiana anytime soon, but there is a real consequence where you have to think about the future of young Quebecers who are being denied access to English because their parents keep electing these demagogic leaders in power who are so hostile to any infiltration of English in Quebec society.
Normand, I'm wondering if we should send him to Alliance Française, and will you pay for it?
Yeah, sure. I think a language is not just something practical for communication. It allows for communication. It's also a factor of identity. And you can never remove identity from the other aspect of communication.
So
it serves two purposes.
Arguing practicality, as JJ is not enough.
It's not enough. You have to consider the other aspect, and I would disagree completely with the fact that it's unique to Quebec. This compound between communication and identity is around the world, in every part of the world, and diversity exists everywhere. It's not just a Canadian story. It does exist in every part of the world. In the US, for example, just our neighbor.
I got 30 seconds left for a smart aleck question. Do you know any French?
I don't know any French. It's never been practical in my life. There's never been any reason for me to learn French, and languages are learned as tools of communication. They are not learned and they are not retained for sentimental reasons, for political reasons.
Any curiosity about learning French?
It is not relevant to my life. I have no reason to learn French.
Conrad, should we teach this guy some French? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it might help to understand. I mean, it's true that politicians, there's a lot of political mileage in the language debate in Quebec, obviously. But I mean, to characterize for French as zero tolerance or C language as a zero sum, I mean, that's just an extreme definition how the language debate evolves in Quebec. Quebecers are very outward to the world. They understand how the world works. People who they speak English, but I mean, does that mean you sacrifice? I mean, you just have to watch Quebec television, absorb a bit of Quebec culture, and understand that people do not adopt language simply for practical reasons. I mean, it's an expression of who they are and their soul and who they aspire to be. And language conditions thinking in many aspects. I'm not a linguist, but I mean, I do understand that just appreciating how someone will translate something from English to French, you understand that you can come at the same issue in two different ways depending on the language you address it in. And that's a very good practice for anyone who wants to understand in someone else's shoes in the world, and that applies to every aspect of your life. And it's just one way in which bilingualism and official bilingualism, however failed an experiment it might have been, has been a richness to this country.
And on that
something
note,
we shouldn't dismiss.
On that note, I am dismissing all four of you with a merci beaucoup, tout le monde. À la prochaine fois. Thanks, everybody. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.